We're visiting with Joe Haynes today, and this is our opportunity to take an in-depth look at your life, both as a lawyer and as a political leader. But Senator Haynes, before we do all of that, with your permission, I'd like to ask you some questions about Joe Haynes the man and about how you came to be who you are. Will that be all right with you?
That'll be fine.
All right, Joe, I understand that you're going to be celebrating your 80th birthday this coming October. Is that correct?
I hate to admit that, but that's a fact.
All right. We probably won't, in the time we have allowed to us, be able to cover the entire 80 years, but we're going to try to see if we can bring forth some highlights. I understand that you hail from Sumner County, Tennessee. Is that correct?
Castellian Springs, Tennessee.
Castellian Springs. Now, if you would, tell us about your early years in Castellian Springs, and I'm kind of leading up to how you ended up going off to college, but kind of from day one up to then, let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, I started to school at a school called Bledsoe, which was at the end of Hilton Lane, at its intersection with Highway 25. And it was a 3-room schoolhouse. Matter of fact, my first grade teacher taught first grade, second grade, and third grade, so I had her 3 straight years. And didn't go to the town school, so to speak, until I was in the 6th grade. So that was a unique experience because the school didn't have any indoor plumbing.
So you were really a country boy.
I was a country boy, and we had a coal house, and we oiled the floors. I never did figure out why they oiled the floors, but in any event, that was the beginning of my education.
Now, when you finally got into the 6th grade or 7th grade, did you finally get to go to town, to go to school? Or?
I got to go to Venus Stewart by way of Howard. Was in Howard a couple of months, and then Venus Stewart was a newly completed school, and that was my beginning in the big time school.
I see. So, and what about high school? What was that experience for you like?
That was a great experience because it had so many activities that I could be involved in, from sports. I played a little football and a little basketball. I wasn't too good at basketball because I was probably too clumsy. But in any event, I loved drama. I was in a play or two, and we won the state play contest twice. So I was in my heaven when I was on mic or trying to perform somebody else.
Well, you know, they say in every lawyer has a little bit of an actor in them, so maybe that was part of a foregone step in that direction. But let me ask you this. Way before the lawyer part of you came about, some engineering took a hold of you, but I need to know, how in the world did you make it from Castellian Springs all the way up to the University of Tennessee in Knoxville? In other words, who inspired you to head up in that direction?
Well, it was sort of by process of elimination. I had applied to some other schools, and I couldn't get a scholarship, and I had a part scholarship to the University of Tennessee, so money was a significant part of being able to go to college because my parents were farmers, and there was not an excess of money. We had to struggle, and I raised a tobacco crop or two in order to pay my way through.
Well, what led you to pursue an engineering degree?
I had the greatest algebra, geometry teacher that was ever known to mankind, Annette Hutton, and she had a son who had gone to Georgia Tech, graduated in engineering, and all I ever heard from the time I entered her class as a freshman was, "I want you to be an engineer." And so I started in engineering and mechanical engineering and graduated in mechanical engineering, and
Well, were there any other engineers in your family? Were you the first of?
There was, I had a first cousin or two that had gone to engineering school, and they were engineers. I had smart kinfolks, so I thought maybe I could follow.
I understand. Now, in your immediate family, were you the first member of your immediate family to go to college?
Not only to college, but to graduate from high school, because neither of my parents had ever graduated from high school, and they were just hard-working people that didn't have the opportunity. I didn't take advantage of it. I
see. Now, somewhere along the way, you met a young lady by the name of Barbara Norman, as I understand it. Can you tell me when you first met that young lady, when that might have been?
I can almost give you the day, the hour, and the minute. She was a very attractive woman, and she got my attention. We were at a dance, and I was so compelled to meet her that I cut in on her and danced with her at that dance. And I guess from that point on, it was history, because as I say, she chased me until I caught her.
I understand. So ultimately, you and Barbara got married to one another, and Barbara Norman became Barbara Haynes. Is that right?
That is correct.
All right. Now, upon graduation from the University of Tennessee, did you return to the Nashville area? Did you come back this way?
We did. We interviewed several different companies. I had several different offers to go to work, from Thiokol Chemical Corporation to Caterpillar to DuPont and others. And we decided to return to Nashville for me to be able to potentially go to law school at the Night Law School.
So when you were making your decision to take a job here in Nashville as an engineer, you had already begun to think about the prospects of going to law school.
As a matter of fact, that seed was planted when I was at the end of my second year in engineering. A man by the name of Richard Harsh, who was a close family friend in Gallatin. He's dead now. But Mr. Harsh's wife had taught me in English in high school, and he sent for me. Told somebody he wanted to see me. I may have told my daddy, because they were good friends. And I went to see him, and he asked, I'd never been in a law office before, and he said, "What are you taking, Joe?" And I told him I was taking engineering, and I just knew he'd be so proud that I was taking engineering. Well, he wasn't. He said, said, "I've been watching you." He says, "You ought to be a lawyer." And so I started to say, what does a lawyer do? But I didn't want to embarrass myself. But in any event, he planted a seed. And so along the way, I thought about using my engineering background and getting a law degree and doing patent law. That I thought that would be a highly specialized field, and I might ought to try it. So I was going to interview Georgetown University at night and go there at night law school, and work at the patent office in Washington. I applied to the patent office, but their starting salary was about $200 a month below what DuPont would pay me back here. So for a little country boy that was poor and had a new wife by that time, or about to have a new wife, I decided that was not the route I needed to pursue.
I understand. So you elected not to go to Washington, D.C.
That's correct.
Did you take the job at DuPont?
I did take the job at DuPont. As a matter of fact, the first couple of years I worked shift work. I swung the shifts. I'd work days, and then I'd go to 4 to 12, and then I'd go to 12 to 8s. And so in the first part of my law school career, I was swinging the shifts. And
so when you say swinging the shifts, were you working in the plant? Were you going to to what some of us used to call the rayon plant or the cellophane or whatever it was out there in Old Hickory?
I was in the cellophane plant, and they assigned me a shift, and I had 8 to 10 men working under me. I wasn't even shaving good, but they were working under me, and it was an exciting venture to be able to supervise men twice my age and get by with it.
Well, now you graduated from the University of Tennessee with that BS in mechanical engineering in 1959. When did you actually start, if you recall, to what was then called the Nashville YMCA Night Law School?
I think there was a year that we missed in there. As a matter of fact, to make preparations for going, I even took a rapid reading course at UT night school, because engineers traditionally read poorly. They read slow, and because you've got to read the fine print to be able to understand what the problem is and try to solve it. So I started law school, I believe, in 61 or 2.
I see. So you went on to graduate from the Nashville YMCA Night Law School in 1965. Were you still working at the DuPont plant the whole time that you were, or at DuPont the whole time that you were going to law school?
Well, I had changed from cellophane to Dacron. They had decided to make me a design engineer. So along the way, I had 2 or 3 years experience as a design engineer, and I designed machines, and I designed buildings that would hold machines. So it was a unique experience to be able to work actually as an engineer. A lot of engineers don't have that opportunity, and so I was afforded that opportunity.
Now, when you graduated from the law school, you were still working at DuPont at that time. Did you stay with DuPont for a little while after you graduated and took the bar exam, or did you just jump right on out there and start practicing law?
Well, I was trying to get up the courage, and I had passed the bar. I had applied for membership to the Nashville Bar Association in the fall of '65, and I may still have the letter that I got back that told me that I was not eligible to belong to the Nashville Bar Association. So I was rejected as a member of the Nashville Bar.
I see.
You had to be a full-time lawyer back in those days. You couldn't even be as I recall, a lawyer with the state of Tennessee. You had to be. There was a certain group of lawyers that wanted to make sure they kept control of the Nashville Bar, and that was how they did it.
So if you weren't in full-time private practice or something of that like, you couldn't belong.
I couldn't belong, and we went along for several months there, and I recall that we were shopping one night in Sears, Barbara and I, and we ran into an old friend from UT by the name of Ray Wilson. And he says, "Joe, what are you doing now?" And I said, "Ray, I'm getting ready to go into law practice." And I didn't tell him I needed somebody to push me, because I'd get cold feet, and I talked myself out of it from time to time, because I already had 2 children at that point, so it was a major hurdle. And he said, "Well, I'm looking for somebody." He says, "I'm Secretary-Treasurer of Central Ramblin'. We've got a bunch of accounts that we can't collect." He said, "Would you know anything about that?" I said, "Not a lot, but I'm willing to learn."
Okay.
So he placed several accounts under my control for me to collect, and that was my first letter that I had ever written to a debtor. trying to collect money. And would you believe that I got some checks in the mail? Some of them were paid in full, and it was my first fees off of as a lawyer.
So you sent out some demand letters. You were successful, and did that give you enough incentive to leave DuPont and hang out your shingle?
Few weeks after that, and I might say that Barbara Haynes was a real instrument in getting those letters prepared, because she typed them on a manual typewriter. And a few weeks after that, I was walking through the plant, and I ran into a gentleman who had graduated from a night law school by the name of Cy Fraser. And he said, "Joe, what are you going to do?" I said, "I read where you passed the bar." And I told him what I was thinking about. He said, "How old are you?" And I told him. He said, "If I were your age, I'd leave tomorrow." Now, here was a man that had a law degree, went the same route I did, had been with DuPont probably 20 years at that point, and he was giving me a signal.
Right.
So I went home that night and told Barbara what he had said. And she says, "If you want to do it, I'll type the letter of resignation." And that night, we prepared the letter of resignation, and I went in the next morning and turned it in.
Now, with the unpaid beloved spouse serving as your paralegal, secretary, confidant, and advisor, I understand that you and with having added a couple of mouths to feed, you then opened up a law office. Did you start out on Buchanan Street first, or did you start in Goodlettsville first, or both?
No, we started on Buchanan Street first.
All right.
As a matter of fact, I designed the building for Barbara's uncle. He owned the property. And the next thing you know, I'm in that office building rent-free, and that was a pretty good deal to start me out. He not only started me out by letting me have the office rent-free, I guess in exchange for me designing the building, but he sent me a ton of cases. If anybody went to see Mr. Bud, as they commonly called him in that community, Bud Norman, Mr. Bud said, "Go see my nephew next door." So suddenly I had a ton of cases coming in, and I didn't know how to handle them. I didn't know what to do next, and I made a lot of phone calls to lawyers downtown who were mentors and helped me along the way.
Now, as I said earlier, by this time you and Barbara had added a couple of new additions to your family, and I guess that would have been, would that be Jeff and
Scott?
And Scott.
Right.
And later on, you'd add Mandy.
Mandy came along about a year after I went into practice.
At this point in your life, did you ever suspect in your wildest dreams that your wife, Barbara Haynes, and some of your children, Scott and Mandy, would follow your lead and that they would pursue legal careers of their own?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Now, more about them later. I want to ask you a little bit about them individually later, but after you graduated from law school and you hung out your shingle over there on Buchanan Street, did you also ultimately have an office in Goodlettsville?
Yeah, I did, and that sort of took place by accident. Jim Smith came by one day. Jim was working as an adjuster for an insurance company, and Jim and I were in the same Sunday school class at Dalewood Methodist Church. And he said something about, I said, "Congratulations on passing the bar," because he was a year behind me. He said, "I'm thinking about opening up an office." And I said, "Where?" He said, "Over on Gallatin Road." And he looked at me and he says, "You don't think that's a good idea, do you?" And I said, "No, I know it's not." He said, "Why?" I said, "Cars just whiz by on Gallatin Road. They don't slow down." I said, that's just a thoroughfare." I said, "That's not where you need to go." He said, "Where do you think we need to go?" And I said, "Well, I think you need to go somewhere like a Goodlettsville community." And at that time, they were building the interstate. They were building Rivergate Mall. I'd had some contact with Goodlettsville because I had a son that was playing some minor leagues, little league sports in Goodlettsville, and so I'd gotten to know some of the people there. And he said, "Well, maybe you're right." I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I don't have an appointment for the next few hours. Let's ride out there and see what's going on in Goodlettsville." So we did, and we found an office building, a building that they were getting ready to sell. And I said, "Well, let's go down here and see Mr. Claude and see what he says about it." He said, "Do you know Mr. Claude Garrett?" And I said, "No, I don't know Mr. Claude, but we can sure meet him." And we walked in and talked to Mr. Claude and asked him about starting a law office in Goodlettsville. And he didn't think it was a good idea. And I was somewhat shocked. He said, "We've got a lawyer out here 2 afternoons a week by the name of Ken Johnson." Said, "We don't need any more lawyers in Goodlettsville." So we got out to the edge of the bank of Goodlettsville, and Jim said, "Well, I guess that takes care of that." And I said, "Oh, no. I said, "He just issued a challenge." I says, "We're coming to Goodlettsville." And by that time it was we, because he and I always hit it off.
Yeah.
And so when the auction took place in a couple of weeks, I was actually out of town at a football game in Knoxville. And it was a Vanderbilt, Tennessee game. And I remember after the game was over, I called Jim and I said, "Well, how'd we do on the auction?" He said, "We bought a building." I said, "You're kidding." I said, "What'd we pay for it?" And that's how our partnership began. And
So Haynes and Smith opened up an office in Goodlettsville. Meanwhile, Joe Haynes still has an office on Buchanan Street.
That's correct.
And I understand the Joe Haynes Alumni Association began to grow. And among the illustrious members of that Alumni Association that came either to Buchanan Street or to the Goodlettsville office were Jude Linehan.
That's right.
Angus Gillis.
That's correct.
And C. Allen Lancaster.
C. Allen Lancaster.
Now, Lancaster had been an engineer at DuPont like you. Jude Linehan, I don't think knew much about engineering. I knew all of them, but
he didn't even know how to spell engineering.
Couldn't spell engineer, and I don't know that Angus could either. But in any event, all of them at some point or another in the early years of the Haynes and Smith operation were also associated with Joe Haynes. Is that right?
That's right. And as a matter of fact, we had 2 offices, as you said. One was Haynes and Linehan, which was Buchanan Street, and the one in Goodlettsville was Haynes and Smith. Right. And it was not until later that Jude decided to leave and go with the DA's office. So Shriver recruited him away from me. And I think that was probably about the time that Allen Lancaster had finished law school, and he and I had been office mates at DuPont and had become good friends. And so we got to talking, and that's when Allen decided to join me on Buchanan Street.
Right. So at that time, am I right in the observation that in the late '60s and early '70s, you were one of the few Nashville lawyers who maintained more than one office at the same time?
That was crazy.
Yeah.
It really was.
You couldn't be in 2 places at once, but you tried to be.
I tried to be, and I had a schedule in Goodlettsville, and I had a schedule on Buchanan Street. And when you walked out of Goodlettsville and you left a file on your desk, it was still there the next week.
I see. Well, let me ask you this. You mentioned that you started your practice with the good fortune of receiving a few collection cases, and then you got some referrals from Uncle Bud, Norman. But what kind of cases and what areas of the law did you and your associates take? What kind of cases, what kind of clients did you have at these two offices?
Well, I remember I was filing income taxes for a while, and across the street from my office was a root beer stand that was owned by Barbara's uncle. And behind that was a little shed, and we made an office out of that, and I was doing income taxes. And that was before we opened up full-time, before I'd left DuPont. There was a guy out Ashland City Highway who ran a little lawnmower shop, and some guy owed him $15, and he wanted to collect that $15. And I wrote a letter, and the guy paid the $15, and he thought I was wonderful. And his name was Tommy Berry. And Tommy was by the Western Auto Associates store one evening and was talking to a guy by the name of Murph Cathcart, who had just bought that store. So Murph was all enthralled with this young lawyer down the street because he too had a lot of collections he needed. He'd bought that business, and he had a stack of collections a mile high. So he told Tommy to tell me to come by. So I went by one Saturday morning, walked in, and old Murph was about 6'4", weighed about 300 pounds. And he saw me coming in, and it was like I'd known him forever. And he said, "Howdy, neighbor." And I went on back to the store. When I left, I had an armful of files that were collections. And I called Barbara at home that day. I remember it. I said, "You're not going to believe this. We got a law practice going." And that was how we started. We handled a lot of things. We handled bankruptcies, collections, a lot of divorce. And believe it or not, we got some good tort cases intermingled in between that.
I see. Now, along the way, you were pretty active, even though the Nashville Bar Association had initially rejected your application to become a member of the bar. You were extremely active in that association and with other bar activities. When were you elected to serve as the president of the Nashville Bar Association?
Boy, that was a fluke, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, you tell me about it. I mean, here's a guy that wasn't allowed to be a member. Later on, you join up, but then you become elected as president of the oldest local bar association east of the Mississippi River.
Well, there weren't very many of us that made the board. As you know, you've got to get elected to the board of directors before you can be considered as president. And so I remember when I first got on the board and walked into a meeting, A.B. Neal looked up and smiled, and he says, "Here comes Jefferson Street Joe." And, of course, there was a quarterback for TSU known as Jefferson Street Joe.
That's right.
And that didn't hurt my feelings because that was a way of them telling me that I was accepted. And so from there on, when it came time for us to elect from our class the president, it was Joe Lackey and me who were nominated. And I was successful. Joe Lackey and I are good friends to this day. We chit-chat every time we get together and reminisce a little bit. But I guess the most awkward feeling I had was we held our meetings in the conference room at Bass, Berry & Sims. Mm-hmm. And that's a long table.
Right.
And when my first meeting as president was sitting at the head of that table. And I don't know whether my knees were knocking or my tongue was tied or what, but that was the beginning of my presidency as a.
Well, let me ask you this. When you took on the daunting task of being the president of the Nashville Bar Association, is it true that the Nashville Bar, had a lengthy history of not electing lawyers from small suburban law firms, for want of a better way of putting it?
I don't know. John Grissom, I think, was from a small firm, and he had been president of the bar, but he was downtown. And I don't know of any other lawyers prior to me who had suburban offices who had the honor to serve in that capacity.
And I take it, in addition to there not being a wealth of suburban lawyers who became president of the bar, there had not been a history of an awful lot of lawyers who graduated from the night law school who became president of the bar.
That's absolutely true.
Okay, so if nothing else, we can label you as a pioneer of sorts in that regard. Well, let me ask you this. Looking back over the 50-plus years since you graduated from law school, Joe, what are the most striking changes that you've seen in law practice and in the way that lawyers serve the public?
Well, I think the camaraderie between lawyers has certainly changed, not necessarily for the good either. It was not uncommon back in those days to pick up the phone and call your adversary and chit-chat and get to know each other. You'd come to motion day and you'd stand out in the hall and you'd discuss potential cases that you had and cases you had against that person. And you'd always have somebody say, well, give me a call. We'll work that out, kind of thing, you know. And so that has changed now. The email, you very seldom now pick up the phone and call your adversary. I recently need a case continued in General Sessions Court. And I sent an email to the lawyer who filed the case. I'm representing the defendant. And, you know, that's something, we didn't have email.
Right.
So you either showed up and asked for a continuance in court, or you wrote a letter, or you made a telephone call.
Right.
So the camaraderie between lawyers is just different now than what it was then.
So that's an area that you would, that's something where we could long for the civility that occurred in the past, and maybe we ought to make that a goal to bring that back in the future. Would that make?
I think that's true.
Okay. You've had a long and successful history of political and civic achievements, both behind the scenes and as a candidate. Let me ask you, what was your first adventure into the political arena, if you can recall?
I can recall, and my associate, as he was then, I guess, Jim Smith, decided to run for the Constitutional Convention. And I don't know whether that was in the 70s. I believe it was in the 70s when that took place. And I agreed to work a box for him on the day of the election. There was a man that I met that day who was working that same box. He was running for the House of Representatives. His name was Bill Bonner. And we got to know each other that day, and we became friends. Later, I became his attorney on several matters. And when he decided to run for the Senate, the state Senate, he ran against Jim Roberson, who was an incumbent. And I remember Jim came in the office and asked, the law office, and asked me not to work too hard against him. He knew I was committed to Bill Boner. And we got Bill Boner elected to the state senate, and then we got him elected to Congress, and then we later got him elected mayor. So that was my, I guess that was my first, but along the way I decided to run for the city commission in Goodlettsville, and in 1974, after living there 3 years in the city of Goodlettsville, I embarked upon that process and got beat, lost by about 90 votes to the then incumbents, and it was 2 years later before some of my opponents who had helped beat me walked in the office and said, "We want you to run for the city commission." And his name was W.C. Moncrief, and I said, "W.C., you helped beat me 2 years ago." He said, "Yeah, but we need you. We need you. If you'll run, I'll back you." And I said, "Are you feeling okay?" And he laughed, you know, he got a kick out of that. And I ran, and we beat the football coach out there about 2-1, and so that was.
So you became an elected official in the mid-'70s as a member of the city commission in the city of Goodlettsville. You had been helping Bill Boner along the way, and so you were a key advisor, but you were also a campaigner for others and yourself. And along the way, some of them were elected to legislative positions, some to executive positions, and some, including your interviewer, to judicial office. And I think I already know the answer to this question, but of all those individuals and all those elections that you were involved in, either as an advisor or a campaigner, which one gave you the most satisfaction?
Well, it was working for my wife, Judge Haynes. She walked in one day and told me she was going to run for judge. And I said, "Are you sure?" And I don't know why I was so stupid to ask that question. And she said, "I am sure." And I said, "Which one are you going to run for?" And she said, "I'm going to run for General Sessions, and I'm going to run against Bob Sutton." And I didn't know it.
He had been appointed by the governor of the state of Tennessee, I believe.
And he had run for re-election, and he had beat Leon Rubin and John Brown about a year and a half or 2 years after he was appointed. So he had already been tested at the ballot box. But little did I know until later, until she admitted it to me, that he had been rude to her in court, and it was concerning something that was real sensitive to her. And so she had a bunch of lawyers outside the courtroom saying, "That's why you ought to run for judge." And it didn't take much to talk her into it, and she was elected.
And so she became if I'm not mistaken, the very first female judge elected to a general sessions court in the history of Davidson County.
That is correct. There were 2 women that were elected that year, and that was Muriel Robinson to Fourth Circuit and Barbara Haynes to General Sessions Court, Part 1.
You know, you have a history of representing or helping the underdogs, several underdogs, and not expected to succeed have won political races, but you've also, in your law practice, if recollection serves, when the Nashville International Airport was going through its largest expansion during the decade of the 90s, you and your firm represented hundreds of families who were being displaced by airport expansion. Is it fair to say that that was one of the most challenging times for you and your partners as lawyers? And do you look back on that with some satisfaction over the results that you were able to obtain for all of those people?
Very much so, and as a matter of fact, during that period of time, I hired a lawyer from the Attorney General's office to come and be with me, Jim Fisher, who had handled a lot of condemnation cases for the state. As a matter of fact, I'd had a case against him myself. We didn't try it. We settled it. But that was a very satisfying role that we played in trying to help people that had a plane in their backyard with all that noise that went with it. And so there were a lot of emotional times where we would have meetings with those homeowners, and as a matter of fact, that was used against me in one of my political races. That I don't know how it was used, but I think when I had opposition by Mike Wooden one time, he used that against me.
When you were first elected as one of the city commissioners in Goodlettsville, did you have any inkling at that time that you might someday serve in the Tennessee State Senate?
No, I did not.
Did you have some idea that you might someday be the chairman of the Senate's Democratic Caucus?
I did not. As a matter of fact, when I first got there, one of my idols soon became Annabelle Clement O'Brien, and she served as chair of our caucus. Bob Rochelle was chair a little while, and then Annabelle, and then, if I'm not mistaken, I followed Annabelle.
Right.
And so that was a unique experience, a tremendous obligation, because you were in charge of helping everybody run for election, run for re-election, and at that time the Democrats had the majority, and we kept the majority.
Well, somehow you managed to balance the maintenance of serving as the senior managing attorney of your law firm and as a state senator while continuing to handle cases throughout the years. We've touched on some of those, and of course the airport representation as being a large one, but during the course of your legal career, are there some other moments or any other individual cases that you would point to or reference as high points in your history as a lawyer, as an attorney?
Well, yes, there are a number of instances I can think of, from the Supreme Court to the Court of Appeals to this courthouse. I recall one time I was getting ready to try a case, and this was during session, which I learned a lesson. Don't try to try a jury trial during the time that you're serving in the legislature, because it's very conflicting. You just pull too many different directions.
Right.
But this case was in Third Circuit Court in front of a man by the name of Joe Losa. And I remember going in the courtroom telling my client they had upped their offer. I don't remember what they'd upped it to, $35,000, $40,000, $45,000. She had head injuries, had some seizures. It was very difficult to prove that. I'd taken some medical proof that I thought tied it down. I told her, but she just said she didn't hear me. Later said that. And we went in and tried the case, and I pushed a little bit too much late that evening to try to get my last witness on, because she said she couldn't be there the next day. And Judge Losa got upset with me, and as Judge Losa was prone to do when he got upset sometime, he would take it out on you a little bit at that moment. He would chew you out, and he chewed me out in front of the jury, which was difficult for me to handle, but you learn how to handle that. And the next morning, I guess it made me look like a liar, but my witness that I couldn't put on that day came to court, and I put her on the next day, and she did well. And the jury brought back a verdict about 3 times what we'd been offered going in. And I said something to her on the way out. She says, "Well, I didn't hear you say that. I'd have probably accepted that." I said, "Well, I'm glad you didn't, because we're okay."
Yeah.
So it's matters like that, it's cases like that you don't forget.
No, absolutely.
Well,
let me ask you this. Speaking of Judge Loser went on to become Dean of the Nashville School of Law after he retired, and early in our interview today, we talked about you being a graduate of the Nashville YMCA Night Law School. And likewise, your wife Barbara graduated from the Nashville YMCA Night Law School in 1976, by which time you had been a lawyer for a number of years. I remember a great controversy over changing the name of the law school to a name that would be more in keeping with the traditions of the only night law school in Tennessee. And I believe, and I know you don't like to beat your own chest, Senator, but I believe you had an instrumental role, both beside and collaterally to Judge Barbara Haynes, but also on your own in helping us to change the name of the law school. Is that right?
That's an accurate statement. I was just assisting her. She was at that time president of the Honor Council, and she figured out which ones we need on our side. She sent me and assigned me certain roles to, Bill Rutherford was one of them, and there were others. And first thing you know, we had a good network of people that were working the board, the dean, and the faculty to make sure that name got changed.
Right. And you were successful in that, in overcoming that opposition as well. Well, let me ask you this. You were first elected to the Tennessee State Senate in 1984 in a contested election against an incumbent senator, Joe Crockett, in the 18th Senatorial District. Once again, you were the underdog, and I understand that you had gotten gerrymandered. They tried to put your house out of the district so that Senator Crockett would not have to put up with you as an opponent. Is that right?
That's right. Actually, what they did was, as you know, the General Assembly is in charge of drawing the district lines for itself. And so my house was suddenly put in Senator Henry's district in West Nashville, as they drew a line out the interstate, out I-65 and around my house, and ran it back to West Nashville.
And you prevailed. I understand you beat Senator Crockett in 1984, and then during regular redistricting, your district ultimately in the 20th district were modified, and you succeeded then Senator John Hicks in the 20th Senatorial District. Is that right?
That is correct. Senator Hicks had decided to retire, and my only competition then was whether Ben West was going to run against me, because I had some concerns about Ben. He's comes from a family with a good name, and had a brother who was very active politically, so I suspected he was considering that. Well, I decided I'd just get the head of the election commission down there to the Senate and to my office, and I'd call Ben in and let him be involved in this discussion about how we'd redraw the lines, and Ben decided not to run.
Consequently, you were elected to the Tennessee State Senate 7 times, is that right?
That's right.
All right. And served in the Tennessee State Senate for well more than 25 years.
28 years.
28 years in all. During that 28-year period of time, I know you voted on and sponsored a number of matters in the state Senate that later became law and opposed many things that you believed were not in the best interest of the public. What would you consider, looking back, of the things that you did while you were in the Senate? What during your service gave you the greatest amount of satisfaction as a state senator in the state of Tennessee?
When we passed the Sentencing Act in 1989, that was a result of a lot of effort on the part of a number of citizens throughout Tennessee, and Judge Haynes had served as chairman of that sentencing commission while she was still in General Sessions Court. And it's the largest bill that the General Assembly has ever passed. We had a problem at that time with staying out of the courthouse with our sentencing. We'd passed Class X crimes under Lamar Alexander, and all we did was back them up in the prison and didn't have the bed space. The tradition of politicians, and I'm not making an exception for myself, is to increase sentencing but not put the money in the infrastructure where you house the prisoners. And so that doesn't work. You've got to put the money up and build the prisons if you're going to increase your sentencing. That's not the way it is now. When you increase your sentencing now you've got to come up with some money to be able to add bed space, and you have to sit down and compute that. So everything's been turned around, but the Sentencing Act was a major accomplishment that put some rhyme and reason into sentencing in Tennessee.
Well, Senator, obviously you brought about some real fiscal responsibility over an area that is of great concern to the citizens, and I salute you for having done that. In 2012, you decided to retire from the Senate, but you're still engaged in the practice of law as we sit here today. In retrospect, if you had it to do all over again, would you still have become a lawyer?
I think it's one of the greatest professions that there is, and yes, the answer to that question is yes. I've enjoyed every minute of it. There are good days and bad days, but it's a wonderful profession.
As I understand it, only one of your three children chose to pursue a different career path than to go forward in the field of law. Two of your children are lawyers, and your wife is both a lawyer and a retired judge. And I wonder if you find some amusement in the fact that Jeff opted out of the legal profession, or do you salute him for his good judgment not to go in that direction?
I think Jeff may be smarter than the rest of us.
Okay.
But I need to add to that my son-in-law, Stephen Young, is a very important part of our family, Mandy's husband, and he's a lawyer too. And as you know, since he appears in your court with some regularity, and so we're equally as proud of Stephen as we are of Mandy and Scott. Jeff's response is sometimes that he hires lawyers, so he doesn't have to be one.
Well, let me ask you this. As we close out our discussion today, there are hundreds, yea, thousands of citizens in this state who will have a career path they want to pursue. Yours has been on a dual parallel path. You've been a highly successful lawyer. You've been a highly successful political and civic leader. I'd like to know what advice you give to young lawyers in our community who might desire to either be involved in the political process or in governmental service in some way.
Well, I think public service is one of the highest callings that you can have. It is, it's not easy to step into the political ring and have to run. when you're running for office, your opponents have got an option of taking you apart in whatever way they think you need to be taken apart. It's sometimes very uncomfortable, but I think it's one of the highest callings there is. Equally with that is the practice of law, because you are seeing that people have their rights protected by bringing their case to court and advising them accordingly. And so I think that it's one of the greatest professions that exist in today's world.
All right. Well, thank you, Senator. It's been an honor and a privilege for me to interview you for this matter today. And on behalf of the citizens of Nashville and the members of the bar, I want to thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.